Joining me now on the program, Congressman Pete Roksam, Chief Deputy Majority Whip for House Republican Leadership. Congressman Roksam, welcome to the program.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being on. First question, you folks, of course, passed cut, cap, and balance yesterday. Our congressman from here in North Dakota, Representative Rick Berg, a co-sponsor, voting for the bill.
A great American, by the way.
Thank you very much. Or I'm sure he thanks you very much for that anyway. He said that it passed in the House. Now the question is, will it pass in the Senate? And if it fails in the Senate, where do House Republicans go from there?
You know, it's interesting. You remember that season at the NFL a few years ago when the Patriots won 16 games in a row, something like that, and everybody said, oh, this is all done. They're the Super Bowl champs. And all of a sudden, the Giants showed up and won the Super Bowl. So my view is, look, this is the only plan that's out there. This is the only plan that's been reduced to writing. This is the only plan that's gotten out of the House of Representatives. Let's see what the United States Senate does. The president hasn't presented a plan. Senate Democrats haven't presented a plan. Let's see what they do when they're given a short, long-term, and medium-term solution to this thing. So I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that the Senate necessarily rejects it.
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, certainly it's true. The Senate hasn't put a plan on the table. As we were discussing earlier in the program, the Gang of Six plan, according to a spokesman from Senator Dick Durbin's office, is really just a framework to create a plan. So what they have is a plan to create a plan, which isn't really anything you can work off in terms of legislation. And then, obviously, the last thing President Obama put on the table that was specific was his last budget he released in April, which adds $9.5 trillion in debt to the budget over the next 10 years. So obviously, I don't think anybody's going to be resurrecting that. So you're right, this is the only thing on the table right now, but it still begs the question, if it goes to the Senate and the Senate rejects it, whether they have a plan on the table or not, where do we go from there?
I think everybody then looks to the White House. Everybody looks at President Obama and said, look, he's president of the United States. We're 13 days out, or by that time, 11 days out from what he has described as an Armageddon event on August 2nd. What's the president's plan to move forward? We know that one thing has to happen. One thing that has to happen is that the trajectory of spending in Washington, D.C. has to change. Because if it doesn't change, not only do we have the problem that your listeners and everybody else is talking about, that the long-term problem in terms of spending money we don't have, and that will catch up with us, but ultimately the markets are going to punish the idea of continuing on the status quo. Yesterday I referred to as one of the leading Democrats on the House floor as the lawyer for the status quo. And so far, what we've seen from the White House is, various sort of vague proposals and talking points, but no substantive language that anybody can deal with. So I think if the Senate Democrats reject this week, then ultimately all eyes turn to the White House and say, President Obama, what's your plan to move forward? And so far, it's been pretty underwhelming coming from the White House.
What do you make of this? Talking about the impact on the markets and the economy, we've had Moody's out saying that we should eliminate the debt cap in order to bring more certainty to the markets. Also, I know Warren Buffett has essentially said the same thing. What's your reaction to that?
Well, if it's just a matter of raising the debt ceiling with no preconditions at all and just continuing to max out the credit card, there's a bipartisan majority in the House of Representatives that wholeheartedly rejected that. That was President Obama's first request earlier this year, and the country, through its elected representatives, said, not a chance. We're not going to move forward on that. So I think most folks say, look, if the debt ceiling is going to be raised, make sure that the cuts are greater than the amount that you're raising it, and make sure ultimately that you're setting yourself up on a pathway that makes sense and is sustainable in the long run. So, there can be folks that can come out and say, yeah, the debt ceiling has to go up, but ultimately the second verse of that anthem is there have to be changes that go along with that.
Is the president? We heard from the president earlier that he would not accept a short-term deal. This is what he said. He said he would veto it if he got a short-term deal to raise the debt limit. But we have audio of White House spokesman Jay Carney seeming to back off that a little bit today. Let's roll that audio.
Look at the whole Gang of Six deficit reduction plan. It's not a plan to raise the debt ceiling. That would take an enormous amount of time to do all of that, even get a bill to put forward. So the president would accept a short-term extension alongside an agreement for larger deficit reduction with some triggers?
Well, let me turn it around a little bit. If both sides agree to something significant, we will support the measures needed to finalize details. But there is no extension without an agreement on something big, a firm, committed agreement on something big. So the point of it, we are not wavering on the president's absolute assertion that he won't sign, a series of ill-defined, sort of a toll booth kind of series of provisions that temporarily or in a limited fashion raise the debt ceiling, and we have to relitigate this again and again and again, not just because it's unpleasant, in fact, not principally because it's unpleasant for everyone involved, because that's bad for the economy. It sends the wrong signal to everyone around the globe about Washington's capacity to deal with its fiscal issues. And one of the things that I think is quite clear is that if we send a signal from Washington that Washington works, that Washington can tackle big problems, that will have a significantly positive impact around the globe. And it will remind people about why the United States is the best country to invest in, why we are, as we have always been, a safe harbor in terms of the security of your investments.
It's White House spokesman Jay Carney. Of course, it's funny that they're never concerned about the economy or the uncertainty when it comes to making the Bush tax cuts temporary. But when it comes to this, apparently they're worried about uncertainty. But what it sounds like there is Obama's backing off a little bit, maybe willing to accept a short-term deal. How does that play into what House Republicans are looking for?
Well, look, you look at President Obama has made many statements and drawn many lines in the sand over his tenure in office, and he's walked back from many of them. This is the same president of the United States that campaigned against extending the 01 and the 03, in other words, the Bush tax cuts, and he signed them into law in December and then argued in their favor and took credit for them in the State of the Union message. This is the same president that said we were going to get out of closed Guantanamo Bay, which is still open. This is the same president that said he is going to get us immediately, essentially, out of Afghanistan, and then he plussed up and sent an additional 30,000 troops there in a surge. So this is the same president that said he wouldn't do a short-term extension on the debt ceiling because it was a banana republic, and then within days his spokesman is walking back from that. And I think it's important to recognize that when it all comes down to it, it is incumbent upon President Obama to lead our country in such a fashion that a majority of Americans can come around a plan that ultimately cuts spending and gets us on a pathway that makes sense. And I think the biggest weakness is the original approach of President Obama and Secretary Geithner, and that was with a straight face to just simply request an additional $2.4 trillion in more spending with no reforms, with no caps, and with no restraining influence whatsoever. And on a bipartisan basis, it was wholeheartedly rejected in the House. So the country is looking to the White House. The country is looking to the person that said he was going to bring everybody together, and I think so far has been pretty underwhelmed.
Bill Clinton says that if he was still president, he would ignore the debt cap, and he would challenge Congress to prove the fact that the debt cap is constitutional in the courts, essentially making the 14th Amendment argument that's been out there so often. My question for you is, do you think that's, I mean, the Obama administration, when asked about it, is kind of demurred about it. Do you think that's a possibility going forward, that the Obama administration would just say, ignore the debt cap and just carry on and ignore Congress?
No, I think it would be a very foolish thing to do. What it would ultimately do is create a great deal of ambiguity and chaos and confusion. If the goal is to settle the markets down and create a predictable pathway, you don't create a constitutional crisis and throw this onto the steps of the United States Supreme Court. It would be a foolish and unwise thing to do.
was cut caps. Some are saying, and I know right now you're focused on, you answered this question, you're focused on, getting cut cap and balance through the Senate. You're focused on that. But, some are saying that cut cap and balance was passed and that it was just symbolic and that it's cover for Republicans ultimately maybe caving and compromising on something else. What's your reaction to that criticism?
Well, look, cut cap and balance is the only plan that's out there, and I think the country needs to focus in on it. In my view, the Gang of Six proposal is a little bit like a white unicorn running down a pathway. The implication is that the country go ahead and vote for $2.4 trillion in raising the debt ceiling in hopes of a promise that maybe something is going to come together under the Gang of Six. And most of the Washington media is saying, look, you can't put that deal together in the amount of time it takes to do it before August 2nd. So I keep coming back to this notion, cut cap and balance is consistent with what the American public said last November in sending new Republicans to Congress, including Rick Berg. It's consistent with the theme of a long-term trajectory, and ultimately it invites the states to take back authority and to say that the balanced budget amendment is the way to move forward. So I think it's the only thing out there, and I think it's a pretty cynical view to say that it's just some sort of a ruse or cover. I mean, it's the only thing that's moving, and I think it's worthy of people's attention.
What's your prediction? Are we going to get a deal by August 2nd?
I think we have to get a deal by August 2nd. The only question is, does the President of the United States recognize that you can't raise taxes in a recession? And that's exactly what he said back in 2009 when he was asked that question in Elkhart, Indiana. And he gave a very eloquent response to that and said, you don't do that because it has an adverse impact on the economy. So we can't raise taxes. We've got to deal with the spending side, and we've got to deal with it urgently and immediately. And the time for dilly-dally is over. The time for leadership is here, and the president is the leader of this nation, and the president needs to articulate a plan and put the plan in writing. And if he does, and it makes sense, and it deals with cuts, we can do it.
Does leadership have a plan? Is there a contingency plan if cut cap and balance doesn't make it through?
Our plan is cut cap and balance, and that's right. The one that's moving.
All right. Couldn't be more clear than that. Thank you so much for being on the program, taking time out of your busy schedule to help us make some sense out of what's going on.
Thanks, Rob.
Appreciate it. Well, once again, that's Congressman Pete Roksam, Republican from Illinois, Chief Deputy Majority Whip. I'm Rob Port, sitting in for the chairman, Scott Hennon, 855-200-1776. If you got any comments or questions, or email me, rob@sayanythingblog.com. We'll be back right after this. Don't go away.